She took her daughter to her friend's wedding only to see her billionaire ex. The daughter's father marry the same friend. Some betrayals don't arrive with daggers in the dark. They come wrapped in ivory envelopes with gold lettering, delivered by couriers who have no idea they're carrying grenades designed to detonate your entire world. Madison Harper learned this truth on a Tuesday afternoon when her assistant placed an elegant wedding invitation on her mahogany desk, right beside contracts worth $8 million and strategic plans that would reshape 3 Fortune 500 companies. The envelope felt expensive between her fingers, thick cardstock that probably cost more per sheet than most people earned in a day. But it was the names embossed in that pretentious calligraphy that stopped her breath entirely. Paige Richmond and Trevor Nash request the honor of your presence. Hi, my wonderful friends. Welcome to Mr. William Chronicles, where powerful stories reveal the strength within us all. If you're new here, I'm so glad you found us. Subscribe and join this family. Let me speak a blessing over you. May you find the power to transform your pain into purpose, the courage to protect what matters, and the wisdom to know that some battles aren't about revenge. They're about reclaiming the throne that was always yours. Madison's hand trembled, just slightly, just enough that she noticed and hated herself for it. 6 years. She'd spent 6 years burying Trevor Nash so deep in her past that his name had become nothing more than archaeological evidence of who she used to be. Back when she was foolish enough to believe in forever with a man whose ambition matched her own. Back before she understood that some people viewed love as a temporary convenience rather than a permanent commitment. And Paige Richmond, her college roommate, the woman who'd held her hair back during brutal morning sickness and sworn eternal friendship over cheap wine and expensive dreams. The confidant who'd heard every intimate detail about Trevor, his fears, his goals, his weaknesses, the exact blueprint of his heart. Madison's office occupied the 42nd floor of Manhattan's most prestigious business district. Through the panoramic windows behind her, the city sprawled like a conquered kingdom. At 33, she commanded this view because she'd earned it through strategy, sacrifice, and the kind of ruthless determination that transformed broken hearts into empires. Aldridge Strategic Solutions didn't just consult for Fortune 500 companies. It made them tremble with respect. Mommy. The small voice belonged to Reese, who appeared in the doorway with her school backpack and that preternatural awareness that made adults uncomfortable. At 5 years old, she possessed intelligence that couldn't be explained away by good schools or expensive tutors. Why do you look angry? Madison forced her expression into neutral territory, a skill perfected through thousands of high-stakes negotiations. Just unexpected correspondence, sweetheart. How was school? But even as Reese settled into the smaller chair beside her desk, pulling out homework with methodical organization, Madison's mind was conducting calculations with cold precision. This wasn't coincidence. Paige hadn't accidentally stumbled into Trevor Nash's arms at some charity gala and fallen into spontaneous love. The timeline assembled itself with horrifying clarity. 2 years ago, Paige had started asking careful questions during their increasingly rare phone calls. Casual inquiries about whether Madison ever kept tabs on that guy from grad school. Innocent mentions of attending tech industry mixers. Strategic probing about Trevor's company valuation, his relationship status, his patterns and preferences. At the time, Madison had dismissed it as idle curiosity. Now she recognized it for exactly what it had been: reconnaissance, market research, intelligence gathering before a calculated assault. Paige Richmond, who'd graduated with a marketing degree and the moral flexibility of a corporate raider, had identified a target. She'd studied his weaknesses using every confidence Madison had ever shared. Then she'd executed a 3-year campaign to capture a billionaire, weaponizing their friendship into ammunition for her hunt. This wedding invitation wasn't a gesture of reconciliation or even a twisted attempt at closure. It was a victory parade. Paige wanted Madison to witness her triumph in person, to see the life that could have been hers being claimed by someone who'd planned every kiss, every shared moment, every whispered promise with a cold calculation of a military strategist. The venue details made Madison's lip curl. Meadowcrest Estate, one of the most exclusive and expensive venues in the Northeast, where old money went to remind new money of its place in the hierarchy. No expense spared for Paige's coronation as the wife of tech royalty. The irony was exquisite in its cruelty. Trevor, who had once promised Madison forever beneath the stars of a Brooklyn rooftop garden, would pledge his future to another woman in a palace built on stolen confidences and manufactured intimacy. "Are you going to that wedding?" Reese asked without looking up from her mathematics worksheet. She was solving problems designed for third graders, working through them with the same intense focus that had once characterized her biological father, though she'd never met the man whose DNA had gifted her with brilliance and those unmistakable amber eyes. Most women would have thrown the invitation away. Most women would have protected themselves from the calculated humiliation Paige had orchestrated. Most women would have chosen dignity over confrontation. Madison Harper wasn't most women. She reached for her phone, already composing the response that would confirm her attendance. Yes, she would honor Paige with her presence at this theatrical production. She would bring Reese, who deserved to see the man whose eyes she'd inherited, even if he'd never earned the right to know she existed. And she would watch Trevor Nash pledge his life to a woman who'd studied him like a business acquisition, while his real legacy sat in the audience, unrecognized and unclaimed. Because Madison Aldridge hadn't built an empire by avoiding difficult battles. She'd conquered every challenge through preparation, strategy, and the kind of focused determination that had transformed a broken-hearted 27-year-old graduate student into a force that made billionaires reconsider their life choices. "Yes, sweetheart," she replied, her voice carrying the quiet confidence that had intimidated corporate titans across 3 continents. "We're going to attend a very important wedding, and we're going to look absolutely magnificent doing it." If Paige Richmond wanted to play games with her past, she was about to discover exactly what kind of woman Madison had become in the aftermath of betrayal. Some women didn't break when you tried to destroy them. They evolved into queens who remembered every slight, calculated every move, and delivered justice with surgical precision. The invitation specified Saturday afternoon, 2 weeks away. Enough time to plan. Enough time to prepare. Enough time to ensure that when she walked into that reception, she would arrive not as a casualty of old wounds, but as the legend she'd spent 6 years becoming. Paige might have stolen Trevor through manipulation and calculated seduction, but she was about to learn that some victories came with price tags that couldn't be paid. And some queens didn't forgive, they reigned. Don't miss a second of this story. Subscribe and turn on notifications. Show some love with a like, and let me know in the comments. Would you attend this wedding or stay far away? 6 years ago, Madison Harper believed in forever. She believed in late-night promises whispered against skin still warm from passion. She believed that when 2 brilliant minds found each other in a world designed to keep extraordinary people isolated, nothing could tear them apart. She'd been spectacularly, devastatingly wrong. It started in a university library at 2 in the morning during final exam season. Madison had claimed her usual corner table on the 4th floor, surrounded by economic theory textbooks and half-empty coffee cups, working on a graduate thesis that would eventually revolutionize corporate consulting frameworks. She was exhausted, caffeinated beyond reason, and completely unprepared for Trevor Nash. He'd appeared like some vision conjured from academic fever dreams, tall, sharp-featured, with amber eyes that held the kind of intensity that came from seeing solutions where others saw only problems. He was a computer science doctoral candidate working on data security protocols that would eventually make him a billionaire, though neither of them knew that yet. "You're wrong about the Keynesian multiplier effect," he'd said without preamble, gesturing at her notes spread across the table. Madison had looked up, irritation flashing hot. "Excuse me. Your analysis. 3rd paragraph." He'd leaned closer, pointing at her handwritten calculations. "You're not accounting for monetary policy constraints in a liquidity trap scenario." Most men who interrupted her work got dismissed with Arctic politeness. But Trevor wasn't most men. He wasn't trying to mansplain or show off. He was genuinely engaged, intellectually curious. challenging her ideas because he respected them enough to debate them. Monetary policy becomes irrelevant when interest rates approach zero, she'd countered, her competitive instincts firing. The fiscal multiplier actually increases under those conditions. Prove it. So she had. For the next 40 minutes, they'd argued economic theory with a kind of passionate intensity most people reserved for physical encounters. She'd scribbled equations, he'd countered with data models, their voices rising with excitement as they pushed each other's thinking further than either had gone alone. Somewhere around 3 a.m., in the middle of explaining liquidity preference theory, Madison had looked up to find Trevor staring at her with an expression that had nothing to do with economics. "What?" she'd asked, suddenly aware of how close they were standing, how the library's empty fourth floor had become its own private universe. "You're extraordinary," he'd said simply. "I've never met anyone who thinks like you do." The kiss that followed had been inevitable, desperate, his hands tangling in her hair, her back pressed against the bookshelf, economic theory abandoned, as they discovered a different kind of equation entirely. The way their minds connected translated seamlessly into physical chemistry, urgent, consuming, the kind of passion that made time disappear and consequences feel irrelevant. They'd stumbled out of that library at dawn, fingers intertwined, already planning when they'd see each other again, already addicted to the way their conversations could shift seamlessly from business strategy to breathless confessions, from intellectual sparring to the kind of intimacy that left them tangled in sheets, discussing dreams that felt inevitable. The months that followed were incandescent. They built something together that felt unbreakable, a partnership where her strategic brilliance complemented his technical genius perfectly. Late nights in his cramped apartment, business plans spread across the bed while his fingers traced lazy patterns on her bare skin. Early mornings where coffee and coding sessions dissolved into wandering hands and whispered promises. "We're going to change everything," Trevor had told her one night, propped up on one elbow, studying her face in the dim light filtering through his apartment window. "Your frameworks plus my security protocols. We could revolutionize how companies operate." "That's the plan," Madison had murmured, her fingers trailing along his jawline. "Build something extraordinary together." "Together," he'd repeated, catching her hand and pressing it against his chest, over his heart. "Always together." She believed him. God help her, she believed every word. Their connection went beyond physical attraction or intellectual compatibility. They understood each other's ambitions, respected each other's drive, pushed each other to think bigger and reach further. When Trevor talked about his startup potentially revolutionizing data security, Madison didn't just support him. She helped him refine his pitch, strategize his approach, identify potential investors. When she discussed her consulting framework ideas, he didn't just listen. He challenged her assumptions, strengthened her arguments, helped her see angles she'd missed. They were building an empire together. Or so she thought. The night everything shattered started ordinarily enough. Madison had cooked dinner in Trevor's tiny kitchen, nothing fancy, just pasta and wine, because she'd wanted the evening to feel special. She'd taken 3 pregnancy tests that afternoon, and all 3 had shown the same result. 2 pink lines. A future expanding in directions she hadn't planned but somehow didn't fear, because they were together. She'd rehearsed how she'd tell him. Casual but meaningful. Important but not overwhelming. She'd even bought sparkling cider to replace her wine glass, planning to let him notice and put the pieces together himself. But Trevor's phone had been buzzing incessantly throughout dinner. Text after text, call after call. He'd been distracted, distant, his attention fragmenting every time the screen lit up. When she'd asked about it, he'd waved her off with vague mentions of investor complications and technical problems. "Trevor," she'd finally said, setting down her fork. "Talk to me. What's going on?" "Nothing I can't handle." His smile hadn't reached his eyes. "Just company stress. You know how it is." But she hadn't known. Because he'd stopped letting her in weeks earlier, she realized with dawning horror. The late-night strategy sessions had become solo coding marathons. The shared dreams had become his individual ambitions. She'd been so focused on supporting his success that she hadn't noticed him pulling away, brick by brick, building walls where there had once been open doors. That night, she'd fallen asleep with the pregnancy test still hidden in her purse, planning to tell him in the morning when he seemed less stressed. She'd woken to empty drawers. No note, no explanation, just the hollow echo of absence in an apartment that suddenly felt cavernous. His clothes were gone. His laptop was gone. The business plans they developed together, gone. As if 6 months of building something extraordinary had been nothing more than a temporary arrangement he could terminate without notice. Madison had sat on the edge of that bed for hours, one hand pressed against her still flat stomach, trying to understand how someone could whisper forever against her skin 1 week and disappear the next. The text came 3 days later. Clinical, efficient, devastating. I need to focus on the company. We want different things. I'm sorry. 10 words to end everything. 10 words to explain why the man who'd promised always had chosen never instead. 10 words that made absolutely clear where she ranked in his priorities, somewhere below his startup, his ambitions, his future that apparently didn't include room for her. Madison had stood in that empty apartment, hand on her stomach, and made a vow. She would never be that vulnerable again. She would build something so formidable that abandonment would become impossible, because she would need no one. Her daughter would grow up watching a mother who bowed to nothing and no one, who transformed betrayal into rocket fuel and heartbreak into empire. Trevor Nash had taught her the most valuable lesson of her life. Trust was a luxury she couldn't afford, and love was a weakness that powerful people exploited. She'd spent 6 years proving that some students surpassed their teachers in ways that would eventually make them regret the curriculum. Reese Madison Harper entered the world on a February morning that felt like cosmic irony. Valentine's Day, that celebration of love and partnership, arrived as Madison labored alone in a sterile hospital room with only a hired doula for company. No hand to hold. No partner to witness the moment their daughter took her first breath. Just Madison, her determination, and a tiny, perfect stranger with Trevor Nash's unmistakable amber eyes. The nurse had placed Reese in her arms, and Madison had felt something shift fundamentally in her understanding of love. This wasn't the passionate, fragile thing she'd shared with Trevor, something that could shatter with a single text message. This was primordial, unbreakable, a love that didn't ask for permission or apologize for existing. "Hello, beautiful," she'd whispered to the tiny face blinking up at her. "We're going to be just fine. Better than fine. We're going to be legendary." It was both a promise and a declaration of war. Most single mothers in Madison's position would have struggled simply to survive, balancing childcare with entry-level jobs, drowning in debt, watching dreams evaporate under the weight of practical necessity. Madison refused to be most mothers. She'd spent her pregnancy transforming rage into strategy, converting heartbreak into a business framework that would revolutionize corporate consulting. Her graduate thesis had been brilliant but theoretical. Motherhood gave it teeth. She understood now what she'd only intellectualized before: how to identify inefficiency, eliminate waste, optimize performance under resource constraints. She'd been doing it every day, managing an infant while building a business on borrowed time and ruthless focus. The consulting framework she developed didn't come from academic theory. It came from lived experience as a woman who had to make every minute, every dollar, every decision count toward survival and domination. By Reese's second birthday, Madison had secured her first major contract, a mid-sized manufacturing company bleeding money through operational inefficiency. She'd walked into that boardroom with a toddler's breakfast still on her blazer and a presentation that would save them $3 million annually. They'd signed within a week. The money from that contract became seed capital. Madison hired her first employee, a sharp MBA graduate who reminded her of herself before Trevor, and took on 2 more clients. Then 5. Then 12. She worked while Reese napped, strategized during preschool drop-offs, conducted calls from playgrounds while pushing swings with one hand. By Reese's 4th birthday, Aldridge Strategic Solutions had opened offices in 3 cities. Madison's framework had been featured in Harvard Business Review. Companies that had initially dismissed her as too young, too female, too unconventional were now begging for consultations they couldn't afford. By the 5th birthday, Madison's name alone commanded six-figure speaking fees. She'd keynote at international conferences, been profiled in Forbes and Fortune, built a reputation that made corporate titans nervous. When Madison Harper agreed to take your company as a client, you knew two things with certainty. She would revolutionize your operation, and she would tolerate exactly zero excuses for mediocrity. Through it all, Reese grew into a miniature miracle. She had Trevor's sharp features, that stubborn chin, those amber eyes that missed nothing. But she had Madison's unshakable composure, her analytical mind, her refusal to accept limitations as anything other than challenges waiting to be solved. At 5 years old, Reese was already reading at a third-grade level, solving mathematical problems that confused children twice her age, asking questions that made adults uncomfortable with their depth and perceptiveness. She attended Brookfield Academy, where senators' children and tech heirs received their early education, and she held her own among privilege that had been inherited rather than earned. Madison had buried Trevor so thoroughly in her past that months would pass without her thinking about him. She deleted his number, blocked his social media, refused to Google his increasingly successful company. She knew abstractly that his data security startup had exploded into a billion-dollar enterprise, that he'd become the kind of tech industry darling that magazines profiled and conferences fought to book. She didn't care, or she'd convinced herself she didn't, which amounted to the same thing, until Paige Richmond's wedding invitation arrived and detonated that carefully constructed indifference. Madison remembered now, with a kind of clarity that made her stomach turn, exactly when Paige's reconnaissance mission had begun. 2 years ago, during one of their increasingly sporadic phone calls. They'd been discussing nothing important when Paige had casually mentioned attending a tech industry mixer in Silicon Valley. You know, Paige had said, her tone deliberately light, I ran into an old classmate of ours. Well, yours really. Trevor Nash? He mentioned knowing you back in grad school. Madison's heart had stuttered, but she'd kept her voice neutral. We dated briefly. Ancient history. He's done incredibly well for himself. That company of his is worth billions now. A pause, loaded with false innocence. Still single, apparently. Married to his work, he said. Good for him. Did you two end badly? He seemed interested when I mentioned your name. That should have been the warning sign. That calculated curiosity. The strategic information gathering disguised as friendly gossip. But Madison had been too busy managing a major acquisition for a pharmaceutical client to notice the trap being set. Over the following months, Paige's questions had continued. Always casual, always framed as coincidental. What had Trevor been like as a partner? What were his weaknesses, his fears, his dreams? Did Madison ever regret how things ended? Did she think he was the kind of man who wanted children eventually? Madison had answered honestly, because she'd still believed they were friends. She'd shared intimate details about Trevor's insecurities beneath the confident exterior. His childhood fear of abandonment after his parents' bitter divorce. His tendency to throw himself into work when emotions became overwhelming. She'd painted a psychological portrait detailed enough that someone paying attention, someone with Paige's marketing background and predatory instincts, could use it as a manual for manipulation. Paige hadn't stumbled into love with Trevor Nash. She'd hunted him with the precision of a corporate raider identifying an acquisition target. She'd used every weakness Madison had revealed, exploited every vulnerability, positioned herself as exactly what he needed during whatever crisis or transition had made him susceptible to her campaign. The wedding invitation wasn't extended out of nostalgia or misguided friendship. It was a victory parade. Paige wanted Madison to witness her conquest in person, to see the billionaire she'd captured using intelligence stolen from the woman he'd abandoned. If you've made it this far into Madison's story, show some love by hitting that like button and subscribing to Mr. William Chronicles. You won't believe what happens when these three finally come face to face. Most women would have sent polite regrets. Most women would have protected themselves from the calculated humiliation Paige had orchestrated. Most women would have chosen dignity over confrontation. But Madison Harper had spent 6 years learning that dignity without power was just another word for defeat. She'd built an empire from betrayal's ruins. She transformed a broken heart into a fortress that could withstand any siege. And she'd raised a daughter who deserved to know where she came from, even if her father had never earned the privilege of knowing she existed. Madison confirmed her attendance within an hour of receiving the invitation. She booked a suite at the estate's luxury hotel. She arranged for a personal stylist to create ensembles that would communicate exactly the right message to exactly the right people. Then she sat down with Reese and explained, in age-appropriate terms, that they would be attending a very important wedding, that they would see people from Mommy's past, that Reese should stay close, be observant, and remember that sometimes adults made complicated choices that children didn't need to fully understand. "Is it going to be fun?" Reese had asked, her amber eyes, Trevor's eyes, studying Madison's face with uncomfortable perception. "It's going to be necessary," Madison had replied, "which is sometimes more important than fun." As she prepared for the wedding over the following 2 weeks, Madison felt something cold and sharp crystallizing in her chest. Not quite anger, not quite satisfaction, something closer to anticipation. The feeling a chess master experiences when an opponent has just made the move that will lead inevitably to checkmate. Paige Richmond had weaponized their friendship to capture a billionaire. She'd orchestrated this elaborate wedding to parade her victory before the woman she betrayed. But she'd made one critical miscalculation. She'd forgotten that Madison Harper didn't lose. She recalibrated, repositioned, and delivered consequences that redefined the entire game. Meadowcrest Estate sprawled across 200 acres like a monument to excess. The Gothic architecture commanded the Hudson Valley with aggressive grandeur that screamed new money trying desperately to convince old money of its legitimacy. Every detail announced its price tag: imported marble fountains, professionally landscaped gardens, trees transplanted fully mature, because waiting for growth was apparently beneath people like Paige Richmond. Madison's charcoal Bentley whispered up the drive with understated elegance that made Paige's theatrical excess look like desperate overcompensation. The car itself was a statement, not flashy, but communicating power without needing to announce it. "It looks like a castle," Reese observed from the back seat, her voice matter-of-fact. "But it's showing off." Madison smiled. "What makes you think that?" "Because real castles just are. This one is trying really hard to make sure everyone notices." Reese adjusted her midnight blue dress with unconscious grace. "That means someone's worried people might not see it." 5 years old and already reading human insecurity like a balance sheet. Trevor's analytical mind, combined with Madison's strategic awareness, had created something extraordinary. Something he'd never known existed, because he'd chosen ambition over everything else. Today, he'd discover exactly what that choice had cost him. The estate's interior had been transformed into a cathedral of excess. White fabric cascaded from 30-foot ceilings. Crystal chandeliers cast prismatic light across walls lined with enough flowers to stock a botanical garden. Everything glittered, gleamed, announced its price with zero subtlety. Madison moved through the arriving crowd with fluid grace, her presence creating immediate ripples of recognition. Heads turned. Conversations paused. The magnetic pull of power at work. "Is that Madison Harper?" someone murmured behind her. "What's she doing here?" "I heard she just landed the Kinsley Group account. $40 million. Reese absorbed the whispers with quiet intelligence, her small hand secure in Madison's. They found their assigned seats in the front section, Paige's calculated placement, forcing Madison to witness every moment with perfect clarity. The seating arrangement was strategic warfare disguised as wedding etiquette. Madison was positioned with unobstructed sight lines to both altar and entrance, surrounded by titans of industry. Venture capitalists who could make or break entire sectors. Tech CEOs whose innovations had revolutionized commerce. Media moguls whose opinions shaped discourse. Everyone who mattered had been assembled for Paige's coronation. "Mommy, everyone keeps staring at us," Reese whispered. "Let them look, sweetheart." Madison settled into her chair with regal composure. Queens are always interesting to observe. Margaret Whitmore approached, wife of a venture capitalist, whose firm had helped fund Trevor's startup. Madison, darling, that dress is absolutely stunning. Important occasions deserve unique presentations, Madison replied with understated confidence. And this must be your daughter. Those eyes are remarkable. She inherited her father's eyes, Madison said with deliberate casualness. Understanding dawned in Margaret's expression. Everyone in their industry knew about Trevor Nash's distinctive amber eyes. The timeline, the features, the implications. Oh, Margaret breathed. Oh my. The processional music began, filling the space with classical melodies selected more for prestige than emotion. The assembled crowd rose with synchronized precision. Madison remained seated several heartbeats longer than necessary, a gesture communicating independence from choreographed responses. When she finally stood, it was with grace that suggested moving on her own timeline. Then Trevor appeared at the altar. Success had refined him into something approaching masculine perfection. His tuxedo fit with precision that unlimited resources demanded. Silver threads in his dark hair added gravitas to already commanding features. But those amber eyes, Reese's eyes, held a distance that hadn't existed 6 years ago, until their gazes met across the flower-drowned aisle. Madison watched recognition detonate across his features. His composure shattered. His hand moved unconsciously toward his chest, that gesture she remembered from when emotions overwhelmed his control. For 3 seconds, the billionaire CEO disappeared. The man who'd whispered forever resurfaced, his expression carrying 6 years of suppressed questions and regrets. Then his attention shifted to Reese. If you're still watching, you're about to witness the most shocking moment of this entire story. Hit that subscribe button and like this video, because what happens next will leave you absolutely speechless. Madison watched his face as the mathematics became undeniable. His eyes widened, registering Reese's features, his chin, his eyes, his unconscious elegance. The timeline computing in his brilliant mind. 5 years old. His features. The woman he'd abandoned, sitting with a daughter whose existence he'd never known about. His hand gripped the altar's edge, knuckles white. His breathing became visible, obvious distress that hundreds of guests were beginning to notice. "Mommy, why does that man look so scared?" Reese asked with innocent curiosity. "It's his wedding. Shouldn't he be happy?" The question carried devastating insight. Trevor Nash looked like a man confronting catastrophic mistake while standing at the altar of his wedding to another woman. The bridal processional began. Paige Richmond appeared at the entrance like a vision from every social climber's fever dream. Her wedding gown was ostentation disguised as elegance, enough silk and lace to outfit a royal coronation, the train requiring 3 attendants to manage. She'd spared no expense. The dress cost more than luxury vehicles. French lace veil, diamonds catching light like captured stars. But her expression revealed the true nature of this performance. Beneath the radiant smile, Madison detected cold satisfaction, a predator claiming her prize after careful hunt. As Paige glided down the aisle, her gaze swept the crowd with calculating attention. When her eyes found Madison, the mask slipped for one heartbeat. Pure vicious triumph. Then her attention shifted to Trevor, and her triumph cracked slightly. He wasn't looking at his bride with appropriate adoration. He was staring at Madison and Reese with desperate intensity that made guests uncomfortable. The ceremony proceeded with flawless execution. But Madison focused on Trevor's responses, analyzing each with strategic precision. His voice carried none of the passionate conviction that had once characterized everything he'd said about their future. His vows sounded like contract negotiations, delivered with mechanical precision. "Do you, Trevor, take Paige to be your lawfully wedded wife?" "I do." Flat, lifeless, all the emotional resonance of a quarterly earnings report. Paige's triumphant smile faltered at the lack of enthusiasm. "Do you, Paige, take Trevor to be your lawfully wedded husband?" "I do." Paige responded with enough enthusiasm for both participants. The kiss lasted exactly long enough to satisfy photographers. Trevor's participation was dutiful rather than passionate. When they turned to face the applauding crowd as husband and wife, Trevor's gaze immediately sought Madison's position. "Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you Mr. and Mrs. Trevor Nash." Thunderous applause erupted. Paige glowed with satisfaction. But as the newlyweds processed down the aisle, Trevor's attention remained fractured, returning repeatedly to where Madison sat with their daughter. Paige had achieved everything she'd plotted to obtain, but her victory was hollow. She'd won a prize that was already broken. The reception area gleamed with the same aggressive luxury that had characterized the ceremony. More crystal, more flowers, more evidence of money spent without restraint or taste. Madison moved through the crowd with practiced grace, accepting congratulations from business associates who seemed surprised by her attendance, fielding questions about potential collaborations with a kind of professional warmth that revealed nothing of the war she was preparing to wage. Reese remained close, her small hand occasionally finding Madison's when the crowd grew too dense or the attention too focused. She was observing everything with that unerringly perceptive intelligence, processing social dynamics that most adults missed entirely. Mrs. Harper. James Richmond appeared beside them, Paige's father, owner of Richmond Industries, a manufacturing empire built on strategic ruthlessness. He was a man who understood power, which meant he understood exactly why Madison's presence here mattered. "What a pleasant surprise. I didn't realize you and Paige had maintained contact over the years." "Old friendships have a way of resurfacing," Madison replied, her tone pleasant and completely empty of actual warmth. "I wouldn't have missed this celebration for anything." James's gaze shifted to Reese with genuine interest. "And this lovely young lady must be your daughter. She has remarkable eyes." "I'm Reese," came the response in a voice carrying unconscious confidence. "I'm 5 years old and I go to Brookfield Academy." The prestigious school's name registered immediately in James's expression. Brookfield was where senators' children and tech heirs received their education, where admission required more than money. It demanded influence, connections, the kind of social capital that couldn't be purchased overnight. "Very impressive," James said with respect that hadn't been present before. "That's one of the finest." "Excuse me." Trevor's voice cut through their conversation like a blade through silk. He'd appeared with the desperate intensity of a man operating beyond his emotional limits, his control visibly fraying. "James, I need to borrow Mrs. Harper for a moment. Business matters." The excuse was transparently false. Everyone present knew urgent business discussions didn't occur at wedding receptions, unless someone was having a crisis. But James possessed enough intelligence to recognize when retreat was wise. "Of course," he replied diplomatically, gathering his composure and withdrawing. "Mrs. Harper, we'll continue another time." As James melted into the crowd, Madison found herself facing Trevor Nash for the first time in 6 years, their daughter standing between them like living evidence of everything that had been lost and gained in their separation. "Daphne." Her old name emerged from his lips with the weight of accumulated history. "I had no idea you'd be here." Paige never mentioned. "I'm sure she didn't." Madison's voice carried Arctic temperature. "Your wife has always been selective about information." His gaze dropped to Reese, and Madison watched mathematical certainty destroy whatever remained of his wedding day composure. Up close, the resemblance was undeniable, the timeline unmistakable, the implications devastating. "She's..." Trevor's voice broke. "She's mine, isn't she?" "Her name is Reese," Madison replied with surgical precision. "She's 5 years old, and she's never once asked about her father, because I taught her that some people aren't worth waiting for." The words hit him like physical blows. His hand moved to his chest again, that unconscious gesture of overwhelming emotion. His eyes filled with tears that he couldn't afford to shed at his own wedding reception, surrounded by hundreds of guests who were beginning to notice the groom's breakdown. "My God," he breathed. "I didn't know. You have to believe me, I never knew. If I had known about her, I would never have left. I would have stayed. I would have fought for us." How convenient. Madison's tone could have frozen water, that you've discovered paternal instincts at your wedding to another woman. How touching that fatherhood suddenly appeals when it comes without any of the responsibility, sacrifice, or sleepless nights. I was manipulated. The words tumbled out desperately. Paige kept us apart deliberately. She fed me lies about you moving on, about you not wanting contact. She made me believe that reaching out would only cause pain. Poor Trevor. Madison's mock sympathy cut deeper than anger ever could. So easily manipulated by a woman with a marketing degree. So helpless against basic psychological warfare. What does that say about your judgment? Your intelligence? Your fitness to be around my daughter? Trevor dropped to his knees on the manicured lawn, bringing himself to Reese's eye level with desperate hope of making connection. But Madison moved between them with swift precision, a lioness protecting her cub. Don't. The single word carried absolute authority. Don't you dare try to insert yourself into her life now. You think DNA gives you access to a child you abandoned before she was even born. I didn't abandon her. I didn't know she existed. Because a real man would have made sure. Each word was measured, precise, devastating. A real father would have checked. A real partner would have maintained contact long enough to discover the consequences of his actions. I can change. His desperation was palpable. I can be the father she deserves. I have resources now, influence, the ability to provide everything. She already has everything she needs. Madison's finality was absolute. A mother who has never failed her. A home where she's cherished. An education that will prepare her to conquer whatever world she chooses. What exactly do you think you could add except disruption and disappointment? The question hung between them like a challenge. Trevor had no answer because his desperation was emotional rather than practical, based on what he wanted rather than what Reese actually needed. She's my daughter too, he said finally, the words carrying hollow legal technicality rather than emotional truth. I have rights. Courts would recognize my parental claims, especially given my resources. The threat transformed Madison's expression from Arctic indifference to something approaching nuclear fury. Try it, she said with controlled violence that made Trevor step backward involuntarily. Go ahead and attempt to use the legal system to force your way into our lives. Discover exactly what happens when you threaten a mother who has spent 6 years building the kind of power that makes judges reconsider their decisions. She leaned closer, close enough to smell his cologne, that same scent that used to cling to her skin after midnight encounters, close enough that he could see the absolute absence of mercy in her eyes. Learn what it costs, she whispered with lethal precision, to wage war against someone who has already survived losing everything and rebuilt an empire from betrayal's ashes. I will destroy you so completely that your company becomes a cautionary tale in business schools. I will dismantle everything you've built with the same methodical precision you used to dismantle my heart. And I will do it while your wife watches her golden prize turn to ash. Trevor's face drained of color. He was finally understanding that he wasn't facing the vulnerable young woman he'd abandoned. He was facing a force of nature who had transformed pain into power and now wielded both with surgical precision. Come, Reese. Madison took her daughter's hand with gentle authority. We've spent enough time with strangers. As they walked away across the manicured lawn, leaving Trevor kneeling on grass in his wedding tuxedo, Madison felt cold satisfaction crystallize in her chest. The first lesson had been delivered. Many more would follow. The walk back to the reception felt like a victory procession. Madison's heels clicked against the stone pathway with rhythmic precision, each step carrying the weight of a woman who had just reclaimed her narrative from people who tried to rewrite it without permission. Reese's small hand remained secure in hers, warm and trusting, a reminder of what actually mattered in this elaborate theater of betrayal and consequence. "Mommy," Reese said quietly, her voice carrying that unsettling perception that made her seem far older than 5. "Why was that man so sad? It's supposed to be the happiest day of his life." Madison paused, kneeling to meet her daughter's amber eyes, Trevor's eyes, though he'd never earned the right to claim them. Sometimes people make choices that trap them in situations they never truly wanted. They build cages around themselves and only realize it when they see what freedom looks like. Is he trapped now? Yes, sweetheart. Very trapped. Behind them, Trevor remained on his knees in the grass, his expensive tuxedo forgotten, his wedding reception continuing without his mental presence. Several guests had noticed his breakdown. Madison could see heads turning, whispers spreading, the kind of social currency that would fuel gossip for months. Paige appeared at the edge of the lawn, her wedding gown trailing behind her like the costume of a performance that was rapidly losing its audience. Even from a distance, Madison could see the moment comprehension struck, the way Paige's triumphant expression crumbled as she registered Trevor's kneeling figure, his obvious distress, the direction of his desperate gaze. Their eyes met across the manicured garden. No words were necessary. Paige understood with sudden, horrifying clarity that her victory was hollow. She'd captured a billionaire through calculated manipulation, but she'd won a man whose heart had never been available for claiming. A man whose attention would now be fractured by the daughter he'd never known existed, by the woman he'd abandoned, who'd become more powerful than he'd ever imagined. Madison offered Paige a smile, cold, regal, utterly devoid of warmth. Then she turned away, dismissing her former friend with the same casual indifference Trevor had once shown when he'd walked out of their shared apartment. Some betrayals deserved forgiveness. Others deserved to be answered with a kind of systematic consequences that redefined entire lives. The car was waiting in the circular drive, her driver standing at attention with professional discretion. He'd worked for Madison long enough to recognize when questions were unwelcome, when silence was the only appropriate response to whatever had transpired inside. "Home, Mrs. Harper?" he asked as he opened the door for Reese. "Home," Madison confirmed, settling into the leather seat beside her daughter. "We're done here." As the Bentley pulled away from Meadowcrest Estate, Madison watched the Gothic Revival architecture recede in the rearview mirror. That palace of lies and calculated excess grew smaller with each passing second, shrinking into insignificance like the people who tried to use it as a stage for her humiliation. "Did you have fun at the wedding?" Reese asked, pulling out a book from her small bag with the same methodical organization she applied to everything. "It was educational," Madison replied carefully. "Sometimes we attend events not because they're enjoyable, but because they're necessary. Because showing up is its own kind of power. Like how you always say queens don't hide from difficult situations? Exactly like that, sweetheart. Before you go, if this story moved you, if Madison's strength inspired you, if you believe in women who transform pain into power, smash that like button right now. Subscribe to Mr. William Chronicles for more stories about resilience, redemption, and the kind of strength that can't be broken. And drop Queen's Reign in the comments if you're standing with Madison. Let me hear you. Reese returned to her book, already absorbed in whatever complex narrative she was processing. Madison watched her daughter read with Trevor's intense focus, watched the way her small fingers turned pages with unconscious elegance, watched the future unfold in miniature, brilliant, self-possessed, unbreakable. Trevor Nash had made his choice 6 years ago when he'd prioritized ambition over partnership, success over responsibility. He'd chosen his company over their future, his empire over their family. And now he would live with consequences he'd never anticipated. Married to a woman who'd manipulated him into position, haunted by a daughter he'd never known existed, tormented by the woman he'd abandoned, who'd become more powerful than he'd ever be. Madison had spent 6 years transforming betrayal into empire. She'd turned a broken heart into a fortress that billionaire tears couldn't breach. She'd raised a daughter who would grow up watching a mother who bowed to nothing and no one, who understood that real power came not from avoiding pain, but from weaponizing it into something that changed the entire game. Her phone buzzed with incoming messages. Business associates who'd been at the wedding, already reaching out with carefully worded inquiries about what they'd witnessed. Media contacts, sensing a story in the groom's breakdown and the mysterious woman who'd triggered it. Competitors wondering if Madison Harper had just added tech industry disruption to her already formidable repertoire of corporate warfare. She ignored them all. Let them speculate. Let them wonder. Let the story spread through their interconnected networks with a viral intensity that scandal always generated among people who believed themselves immune to consequences. Trevor would wake up tomorrow in his hollow victory, married to a woman he'd been manipulated into choosing, haunted by a daughter whose existence rewrote his entire understanding of his past. Paige would wake up realizing she'd won a prize that was already broken, a man whose attention would be permanently fractured by what he discovered at his own wedding. And Madison would wake up exactly as she had for the past 6 years, powerful, purposeful, unbreakable. She would continue building her empire. She would continue raising her daughter to be extraordinary. She would continue proving that some women didn't need redemption arcs because they'd already written their own resurrection stories in blood and brilliance. The city skyline appeared on the horizon as they drove back to Manhattan, her kingdom, her territory, her conquered ground. 42 floors up, her corner office waited with contracts worth millions and strategic plans that would reshape industries. Her empire continued regardless of the drama she'd left behind at Meadowcrest Estate. "Mommy." Reese looked up from her book one more time. "Will we see that sad man again?" Madison considered the question carefully. Trevor would try, she knew with certainty. His desperation wouldn't evaporate overnight. He would attempt contact, make demands, perhaps follow through on his legal threats. He would try to force his way into a life he'd abandoned, claiming rights he'd never earned through years of presence and sacrifice. And when he did, Madison would be ready. She would meet every assault with a kind of systematic resistance that broke lesser opponents. She would demonstrate exactly what happened when you threatened a queen who'd already survived her own destruction and emerged stronger on the other side. "Perhaps," she told her daughter truthfully. "But if we do, you'll understand something important. Some people only recognize value after they've thrown it away. By then, it's too late. The door has closed. The opportunity has passed. And all they can do is kneel outside the fortress they could have lived inside, if only they'd been wise enough to stay." Reese nodded with understanding beyond her years, then returned to her book. The Bentley carried them home through the city that had watched Madison's transformation from broken-hearted graduate student to corporate legend, that had witnessed her climb from nothing to everything through determination that refused to accept defeat as permanent. Trevor Nash had taught her the most valuable lesson of her life, that the only person you could truly count on was yourself. That love was a luxury powerful women couldn't afford. That trust was a weakness predators exploited. She'd learned the curriculum, mastered the material. Then she'd exceeded the teacher in ways he was only now beginning to comprehend. Some queens forgave. Some queens forgot. Some queens moved on and let the past remain buried. Madison Harper wasn't that kind of queen. She was the kind who remembered every slight, calculated every consequence, and delivered justice with the precision of a surgeon and the patience of a strategist who understood that true victory took time. Trevor's wedding day had been Paige's coronation, but it had also been the opening act of his systematic education in exactly what it cost to underestimate a woman who'd already survived his worst and built something magnificent from the ruins. The game had only just begun, and Madison always won.